I wanted to support my husband, even if his mom treated me poorly like a servant, and even if he didn't stand up for me. But things changed when his favorite brother got hurt and became half paralyzed. My husband started making fun of him, and even teamed up with his mom to make fun of me. That's when I decided I wouldn't take it anymore. Holding my brother-in-law's hand, I promised to get back at my husband and mother-in-law. My name's Mia, and I live with my husband Kent while we work together. I feel really overwhelmed because I have a ton of work to do at home and with my job, and I never get any time for myself. It's because my in-laws, who live nearby, keep asking for my help. Even though my husband and I both work, he never helps with the housework. My mother-in-law treats me more like a maid than a daughter-in-law. Mia, today you need to take your brother-in-law to the hospital. My mother-in-law calls me early in the morning on my day off. I'm supposed to take care of my brother-in-law's daily needs when I'm not working. Before, I was basically forced to drive him around like a taxi, but now I'm looking after him because he's half paralyzed. I'm always sorry, Mia, my brother-in-law said apologetically, but I shook my head. I'm doing it because I want to, so please don't worry, I replied smiling, but his expression seemed troubled. Before the accident, he was my mother-in-law's favorite. He graduated from a great university, landed a job at a big company, and was kind and gentle to everyone. It seemed like my mother-in-law only had eyes for him, as if he were her only son, leaving my husband, the second son, feeling ignored. Sometimes I got mad at my mother-in-law for treating my husband unfairly. That's why I always wanted to support him. But things changed drastically when my brother-in-law, who used to be so successful, ended up in a wheelchair after the accident. I honestly wish he'd leave already. Being disabled and unable to earn money is bringing shame to the family. My mother-in-law's words were harsh, considering all the help my brother-in-law had given us. She treated him like he didn't belong, which was incredibly cruel. And to make it worse, my husband started joining in, mocking my brother-in-law along with my mother-in-law. So he's paralyzed and can't even move a hand, huh? Doesn't matter if you went to a fancy university, once you can't walk, it's all downhill from there, right? When I thought about my brother-in-law, unable to move his legs because of the accident, I couldn't fathom how they could say such things. Unlike my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law was kind to my husband too. But despite that, my husband's remarks only made things harder for my brother-in-law. After all the hospital visits, I hope he'll move out soon. We can take care of my mom ourselves, and he's just a burden now, a disabled person who can't contribute anything. My husband's words were hurtful, and I found myself arguing with him. I reminded him of all the things my brother-in-law had done for us in the past, and that his injuries were just the result of a terrible accident. We shouldn't speak about him like that, especially since he treated my husband equally. I also opened up about how I'd been treated by my mother-in-law all this time. I endured verbal abuse and was made to run errands on my days off. But I went along with it because I hoped my mother-in-law would change her attitude toward my husband and maybe even acknowledge me a little. But no matter how much I pleaded, my husband didn't seem to understand. Since my brother-in-law's accident, my husband suddenly became the priority for my mother-in-law, who used to dismiss him. It was understandable that he'd feel happy about it, but for me, I just couldn't relate. The sudden and extreme change in her attitude was shocking. My mother-in-law was never easy to deal with, but I never expected my husband to change so drastically. Looking back, my husband often left all the household chores to me, but I believed he was making efforts in his own way. That's why his sudden change in attitude was so shocking and upsetting. One day, while feeling frustrated with my husband and mother-in-law, my husband suggested a family trip. I was thinking we could go to Hawaii for a change of scenery and have some fun, he said. As a working couple, we could afford a trip, but what about my brother-in-law who couldn't join us? Would he be left alone at home? When I voiced my concerns, I learned that a helper would be hired while we were away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt for my brother-in-law and started worrying if I could even enjoy the trip. A little something to look forward to wouldn't hurt, my brother-in-law said a few days later, sensing my struggle with my husband's idea. I heard about the trip. Don't worry about me. Go and enjoy yourself. You've always been there for me during the hospital visits and everything else. It's time for you to relax and have some fun. His kindness touched me, and I joked that going on a trip with my husband and mother-in-law might be more exhausting than usual, which made my brother-in-law laugh. Encouraged by his words, I told my husband we should go ahead with the trip, and we began preparing for our Hawaii adventure. I took charge of planning the itinerary and dealing with the travel agency. My mother-in-law kept changing her hotel and activity preferences, making it a bit challenging to finalize the plans. But finally, 2 weeks before our departure, everything for our Hawaii trip was set. As soon as we landed in Hawaii, I made a decision to separate from my husband and mother-in-law. I had already felt used even before the trip, so I had planned for this moment. Plus, I needed some time alone, which I had been longing for since the days leading up to our departure. Most of my effort went into helping my mother-in-law prepare for the trip. I'd rush to buy the things she needed after work, and on my days off, I'd take her to the store so she could pick out what she wanted. These shopping trips with my mother-in-law would easily take up 4 hours each time. The 2 weeks before our departure were packed with this and assisting my brother-in-law with his hospital visits. Then, on the day of the trip, my husband and mother-in-law chuckled and told me, "You stay and take care of your brother." Those words left me speechless and utterly stunned. "Since I usually take care of my son, this time it's your turn. Hiring a helper costs money, but you do it for free," my husband and mother-in-law joked, laughing it off. Their demeanor left me feeling no anger anymore. They left for the airport without me, and I stood frozen in place even after their car vanished from sight. Once back home, I used the spare key to enter my in-laws' house. I found my brother-in-law lying down in the living room and told him about what had just occurred. "I'm sorry for suggesting the trip, but I never imagined it would turn out like this," I told my apologetic brother-in-law, reassuring him that this outcome was probably for the best. I hadn't expected much from my mother-in-law to begin with, but this incident also revealed my husband's true colors. I struggled to put my feelings into words, but at that point, I didn't really care anymore. As I glanced down at my brother-in-law's immobile lower body and left hand, I suddenly saw him rise to his feet. It was shocking because he wasn't supposed to be able to move like that. "What's happening? How are you standing?" I blurted out in surprise. Unable to contain my astonishment, I asked my brother-in-law, who then explained that he wasn't permanently paralyzed. It turns out he had been wanting to put an end to my mother-in-law's excessive interference for a while. He had chosen to stay at the family home because he couldn't afford to live on his own. "I'm barely making ends meet," he explained. When my mother-in-law insisted on him staying, he felt pressured to comply, fearing it might cause trouble for my husband and me. "My mother spends money recklessly. I thought my life would be ruined if things continued like this." I was naive at the time of the accident, he admitted. He had been contemplating how to break free from his mother's hold without causing issues for us. The turning point came when he pretended to be paralyzed and unable to walk. That's when my mother-in-law's attitude towards him changed. And just as he was wondering what to do next, my mother-in-law began favoring my husband. Listening to his story, I couldn't help but feel genuinely sorry for my brother-in-law. "It's really frustrating, isn't it?" I replied with a wry smile, and my brother-in-law returned the smile. "Well, shall we fight back then? What do you think? You can join in, Mia," he suggested. I had no intention of letting things end like this. This whole situation had disgusted me with my husband and mother-in-law. So of course I agreed to my brother-in-law's proposal. 1 week later, my mother-in-law and husband returned from Hawaii. As soon as they arrived home, my husband called me. "Hey, where are my things?" The apartment was empty when I got back. I explained that I had sent his belongings to my in-laws' house. "I made it so you can live with your mother like you've always wanted," I tearfully told him. But instead of understanding, he started complaining about how I moved his stuff without permission. Ignoring his reaction, I told him I want a divorce. "This is too selfish." He was taken aback, demanding to know what had come over me and who was the selfish one. Finally finding my voice, I confronted him about his betrayal of my trust and how much I had endured for him. And during the preparations for the move, even more of his wrongdoing came to light. It turns out he was secretly giving money to my mother-in-law without telling me. Looking back, my mother-in-law's extravagant shopping habits continued even after my brother-in-law quit his job. I had always assumed he was the one funding her spending, but it turns out he had significantly cut back on his expenses after leaving his job. That meant my mother-in-law must have been getting money from someone else, and the only likely candidate was my husband. "You need to repay the money you've been spending without my knowledge," I know $22,000 had gone missing in the past few months, I told him firmly. In response, my husband offered weak excuses, but nothing he said seemed to justify what he had done. Realizing that everything I said was true, he couldn't come up with any valid reasons. I informed him that my brother-in-law had already moved out, and I was living in a new place. I made it clear that neither my brother-in-law nor I wanted anything to do with him or his mother anymore. It's best for you to go live with your parents. Your family seems to only consist of your mother-in-law, right? I said before hanging up, but my husband's angry voice cut through. You're so insolent. I should have divorced you long ago, just like my mother said, he shouted. Even in that moment, he brought up his mother. Though it was my honest feeling, his words felt like a relief. His straightforward declaration of divorce was appreciated. Shortly after, a pre-filled divorce form arrived from my husband's end. I submitted it to the city office and sorted out the financial matters swiftly. Finally, I was free, but this was just the beginning. I submitted the divorce papers. I informed him over the phone. His response was curt. Now that I don't have a nagging wife and a disabled brother around, things will be much better for me. This is the best outcome, huh? He laughed. I laughed too, adding, your brother-in-law has semi-retired and is enjoying life abroad. And did you know he wasn't actually paralyzed? Oh, and your mother-in-law has some debts, so good luck with that. I thought I heard him say, huh. But I hung up, blocked his number, and decided he was just a stranger now, someone I didn't need to care about anymore. A month later, I received a letter from my ex-husband, Kent, sent through a lawyer. The letter was a mix of complaints, apologies, and an unthinkable proposal to remarry me. I'd often wish you were still with me. My salary alone can't support my mother anymore. It's impossible, he lamented in the letter. It was filled with such absurd concerns, and I could almost sense the traces of tears in his words, which made me feel nauseous. I promptly threw the letter away. It appeared that my ex-husband had lost all his assets trying to repay my mother-in-law's debts. Yet it wasn't enough, and they ended up losing the family home. As for my mother-in-law, she was desperately searching for my brother-in-law, who had gone overseas. According to my brother-in-law, she had been reaching out to his acquaintances and former colleagues. Despite her efforts, none of them intended to disclose his whereabouts. And even if she did find out, she wouldn't be able to go there. This situation was putting my second son at risk. I want to see my older son, she reportedly said, but none of my brother-in-law's acquaintances were willing to help her. It seems that life with Kent has been quite challenging for my mother-in-law since the divorce. Meanwhile, I've been enjoying a peaceful life in my new single-person apartment. It's remarkably calm compared to the chaos of before. It's been a year since the divorce, and for the last 6 months, I haven't heard a word from my ex-husband. Then today, I received an email from my brother-in-law abroad after a long silence. The email contained news that my mother-in-law had finally gone bankrupt, her name even listed in the official Gazette. Curious, I did some digging and discovered that Kent and my mother-in-law are now cohabiting in a small one-room apartment. Needless to say, they're not getting along. Kent is struggling to make ends meet and is drowning in debt, all because of my mother-in-law's uncontrollable spending habits. The sight of them disgusts me, but strangely, recalling the past doesn't fill me with anger anymore. It seems the revenge my brother-in-law and I carried out, what we called a counterattack, has had more than enough effect.